Welcome to the virtual panel discussion on implementing the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines for adults. My name is Julie Campbell. I'm an exercises medicine representative from Queen's University and one of the co-leads of this event. We are really excited that you're all here today to learn how to implement these guidelines in your life and the lives of others. So before we begin, we just wanted to remind you that this is a listen and view only webinar. We encourage you to find a comfortable place, whether that be standing or sitting, and get ready to engage in our discussions. We have one poll that we will be using today to engage attendees, and we welcome your participation in that as well. After each speaker, we will have a 10 to 15 minute Q&A period. To submit a question live, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can select to submit it anonymously, but your name will not be entered into the gift card draw after this webinar. We will have someone monitoring the chat so that your questions can be asked to our speakers. We also want to note that throughout this presentation, if you are having any technological issues, please reach out to the EIMC24HMG panel at gmail.com. Next, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge that while we are zooming in from across the country, it is important to continue to engage in a process of reconciliation and reflection in which we seek to understand the history of the land we reside on and honor this land. We are very grateful to be able to continue to learn and live on these lands. We encourage you to follow the link that has been posted in the chat to familiarize oneself on the land in which they are situated on. We'd also like to thank both the Queen's University and the University of Toronto EIMC chapters for making this event possible, and to our panelists who have dedicated their time to assist us in implementing the new movement guidelines into our daily lives. So we want to hear from you. What is your favorite way to make your whole day matter? We're going to have a little poll here. Okay, let's see if we can get the results. Nice, looks like all of the options were chosen at some point, and moving with friends and family was the most popular. So yeah, that's a great way, and yeah, thank you guys. So to achieve our goal today, we will first have an introduction from our moderator. Then we will move into the panelists' individual movement behavior topics, each followed by a Q&A period. Then we will finish off with a general Q&A for any remaining questions that can be answered by any of the speakers. And as a reminder, individuals who ask questions submitted in advance or during the webinar will be placed in a draw to win one of 5 $15 e-gift cards following this event. So first, we would like to welcome and introduce our moderator for this event, Dr. Jennifer Tomasone. Dr. Tomasone is a faculty member in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University. Dr. Tomasone is also a faculty advisor for exercises medicine on campus at Queen's University and was the knowledge translation lead for the 24-hour movement guidelines for adults. We are so grateful for Dr. Tomasone to give her time to moderate this event, and we are very excited to have you with us today.
Great, thanks so much, Julie, and thank you to the EIMC groups for organizing today's event and for the invitation to moderate. I'm really excited to introduce the guidelines and moderate this remarkable panel that is lined up. Here we go. Let's go. So this past October, the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines for adults were released, and they were the first 24-hour movement guidelines for adults. So I just want to quickly acknowledge that these guidelines were funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada, the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, Queen's University, and Participaction. So as you can see here, the guidelines offer recommendations for how we can make our whole day matter. The guidelines specify that for optimal health benefits, we need to move more, reduce sedentary time, and sleep well each and every day. Moving more involves adding moderate movement throughout your day, including, here we are, including at least 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week, muscle strengthening activities at least twice per week, and several hours of light physical activity each day, including standing. For sedentary behavior, the guidelines specify that adults should limit sedentary time to 8 hours or less, with no more than 3 hours of recreational screen time each day, and that long periods of sitting should be broken up as often as possible. And finally, the guidelines recommend that we set ourselves up for 7 to 9 hours of good quality sleep on a regular basis with consistent wake and bedtimes. But moving more, reducing sedentary time, and sleeping well is easier said than done. And EIMC at Queen's and U of T have brought together this phenomenal panel of experts to help give you ideas for how you can enact the guidelines in your everyday lives. You are not alone if you're finding it challenging to move more, reduce sedentary time, and sleep well. Here is some data from over 20,000 post-secondary students across Canada who participated in the 2019 Canadian Campus Wellbeing Survey. The findings of the survey suggested that 61% of students were getting 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity each week. 56% of students were getting 8 hours or less of sedentary time, but only 36% of students were getting less than 3 hours of recreational screen time each day. 60% of students were getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night, and this seems promising, but taken together, only 10% of post-secondary students achieved all of the components of the 24-hour movement guidelines. But keep in mind, though, that this data was collected prior to COVID-19. We know from Statistics Canada that Canadians have decreased their physical activity levels during the pandemic, particularly light or incidental physical activity. We just aren't commuting to work or to school, and so we've lost that active transportation time. You didn't have to take many steps to walk from your bed to your desk to get to this webinar the way you may have walked to and from campus, for example. This decrease in physical activity has been replaced with increased sedentary time, particularly screen time, and Canadian sleep patterns have been disrupted. We still don't know what all this means for students' adherence to the guidelines or the long-term consequences of these negative changes in behavior. And so we're here to help you achieve a healthy movement profile because it's more important than ever. So Canada has led the way for movement guideline development. The first 24-hour movement guidelines were for children and youth, and they were released in 2016. Then we had the early years come out in 2017, and most recently for adults aged 18 to 64 and adults aged 65 and older this past year. Before the release of this family of guidelines, movement behaviors were considered in isolation or separate from one another, and their associations with health outcomes were looked at individually. However, we've seen a recent paradigm shift, and we have advanced statistical techniques that now allow us to investigate the integration of these movement behaviors over each 24-hour period. Seems to have. There we go. So 24-hour movement guidelines are underpinned by the idea that these 3 behaviors exist on a continuum. If you think of what your body does over the course of a day when you are not being physically active, you'll likely say that you're not moving. You may be sitting, you may be laying down, or you may be sleeping. So over the course of a 24-hour period, we all engage in a mix of movement and non-movement behaviors, and these behaviors exist on a continuum from low to high energy expenditure. So starting with sleep in purple, we know sleep is a regenerative non-movement behavior, and we expend very little energy while we sleep. We may find ourselves sleeping in a laying, reclining, or a sitting posture. Then when you're awake and your body is in a lying, reclining, or sitting posture, and we're not moving a whole lot, then we're engaging in sedentary behavior. So if you're sitting in a chair or laying in your bed while you're watching this webinar, you are expending slightly more energy than if you were sleeping, and your non-movement would be classified as sedentary behavior. But if you were to assume a standing posture, or you were to start moving more of your body while in a lying, reclining, or sitting posture, then your energy expenditure would increase further and you would enter this green physical activity zone. And as you move more of your body, you expend more energy and your physical activity intensity increases from light to moderate to vigorous. So standing is considered light physical activity because it uses more large muscle groups in your core, your back, your glutes, and your thighs than sitting. So part of the paradigm shift in the literature with respect to these three behaviors is the consideration of their interrelatedness. I'll bet that you have found yourself in a situation where you have not gotten a good night's rest. You probably woke up in the morning feeling lethargic, and the fatigue probably stayed with you the whole day. Now, getting physical activity is challenging on the best of days, but on days when you've not gotten enough sleep, it is even more challenging for you to get activity, and so you may default to more sedentary behavior. However, sedentary behavior can delay your sleep onset or minimize your sleep quality, which means another night of insufficient sleep, and so the cycle can continue. So not only does time spent in one behavior impact our engagement in the other two, but all three behaviors have independent and combined effects on various health outcomes. New statistical modeling called isotemporal substitutions have allowed epidemiologists to model the health impact of trading out time in one behavior and adding it to another. So for example, what is the health impact of cutting our sleep short by 30 minutes and watching another 30 minutes of Netflix? Or trading that 30 minutes of sleep for 30 minutes of light physical activity, or 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And then we can also look at the opposite isotemporal substitutions. So what happens if we turn off Netflix and we trade in for 30 minutes more of sleep? So Dr. Ian Jansen from the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's was responsible for exploring these relationships, and I'm thankful to him for letting me use this slide today. What Dr. Jansen found was that for optimal health benefits, we need to first preserve sufficient sleep, then maximize our time spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity, then light physical activity, and we need to try to minimize sedentary behavior where possible. In other words, reallocating some sedentary time into any of the other movement behaviors is associated with health benefits. We have a finite amount of time each day, right? Each day is only 24 hours. And so we have the opportunity to make the most of it by trading sedentary behavior wherever possible with more light and moderate physical activity. So if you would like to and you're able to get active, even if just by stretching or standing at any point during today's session, you would replace some of your sedentary time with some light physical activity and be making progress towards a healthier movement profile. I keep talking about these optimal health benefits, and so I'll quickly touch on what I mean. The long-term benefits of these guidelines include lower risk of death, many chronic diseases, and falls and fall-related injuries. We also know that following the guidelines is associated with improvements in bone health, anxiety, depression, dementia, cognition, and quality of life. So everyone should be able to find a long-term benefit that is important to them. But for those who are motivated by shorter-term benefits, we know that following the guidelines is associated with elevated mood, more positive outlook, and an increased ability to focus. During the pandemic, we're seeing that people prefer to focus on short-term benefits to get them through their day-to-day routine. And so you may find these short-term benefits are even more salient to you right now. I just want to highlight that the guidelines were rigorously developed with involvement from over 30 Canadian and international researchers. They followed the same gold standard rigorous process that is used internationally to create all clinical practice guidelines. And so we can trust the process was rigorous and transparent, and that the resulting guidelines are credible and trustworthy. We had leading experts looking at the literature, and we had extensive consultation from health professionals, policymakers, educators, and members of the general public from across Canada. And actually, these guidelines took us 2.5 years to develop from start to finish. I'd just like to end our introduction by pointing out some additional novel features that you may not know about these guidelines. So typically, physical activity guidelines around the world usually only make a recommendation for moderate to vigorous physical activity. But our Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines are the first to make recommendations for light physical activity. So we know we can do several hours of light physical activity, and this can sound daunting, but keep in mind the examples that I've listed here. There are many ways that we can trade in some of our sedentary time for one or more of these activities. Another novel feature is the emphasis on the interconnectedness of the behavior because they all exist on a continuum. So the top of the guideline explains that adults should be physically active each day, minimize sedentary behavior, and achieve sufficient sleep to achieve health benefits. This integration statement continues at the bottom of the guideline, which explains what we just talked about, replacing sedentary time with additional physical activity, particularly moderate to vigorous where possible, and then preserving sufficient sleep in order to see even greater health benefits. And finally, it's important to note that progressing towards any of the recommendations will result in some health benefit. This means that even small positive changes in any of the behaviors will pay off with respect to the health benefits associated. Some is always better than none, and then once you're doing some, you can try to aim for more. If you would like more information about the evidence underpinning the guidelines, please refer to the special supplement of the Applied Physiology, Nutrition, and Metabolism journal released the same day as the guidelines. Our host is going to post a link to the special issue in the chat in case you're interested. Okay, it is now my pleasure to introduce our first panelist speaker, Dr. Jean-Philippe Chaput. Dr. Chaput is an associate professor of pediatrics at the University of Ottawa and is a researcher with the Healthy Active Living and Obesity Research Group at the CHIO Research Institute. Dr. Chaput's research focuses on health promotion and obesity prevention, and he led the sleep component of the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines. We're very happy to have you today, Dr. Chaput, and so I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Jen. I would like to thank the host for inviting me to this session today. I think it's very important. I would like to apologize before starting because we just moved a new house here and you may hear some noise around. So my dog may bark and whatever. So there'll be some noise. And I would like to answer one of Jen's questions. So in your 24-hour cycles, I'm standing right now. So I'm doing some light physical activity, so which is not bad, I guess. So what I will do with you today for the next, they told me 5 minutes max, is going to be quick, but lots of time for questions, is to talk a bit about sleep and more the practical aspects of sleep. Bear with me, I'm just trying to change my slide here. Maybe the host can help me. Okay, thank you. So Jen talked about that. So that was a figure that I did in 2014 in that paper to introduce what was about to come in 2016, the first 24-hour guidelines for children and youth, to show that the whole day matters. We need to think about those three behaviors because if you add up those three, it's 24 hours. So we know that if we don't sleep enough, we tend to be more tired, less likely to move. By moving every day, we have a better night's sleep. When you don't sleep enough, you tend to sit more, engage in more screen time. Screen time before bed tends to reduce sleep quality, and there is this displacement between physical activity and sedentary time. So I think we need to talk with all three as a whole when we talk about 24 guidelines. And I'm happy to know that now we have 24 guidelines in Canada. Next slide, please. Okay, and Jen talked about that too, that all of those behaviors are codependent. So any increase or decrease in one of those behaviors will impact at least one or two of the other behaviors. So I think it's important for public health, for messaging too, because the benefits of exercising or being more active are not the same if it's done at the expense of sleep or at the expense of sedentary behavior. So before we're telling people to move more, but we need to think about trade-offs and where do we take that. So people were waking up early in the morning to go for a run or to move. It's not as good as if they were giving up TV viewing or if they were reducing their sitting time. So those trade-offs or gives and takes, we need to take that into account because it can impact outcomes. So seeing that as a whole is very important. Next slide, please. Okay, and how these guidelines help inform research, policy, and practice. I think it's good for a better integration of sleep into public health in Canada. We talk about research, for example. So it's part of our surveys now in Canada to talk about sleep, physical activity, screen time, sitting time. In the media, we talk about the public health aspect of sleep. When I was going to sleep meetings before, it's really geared toward the treatment of sleep disorders, which is important. But I think the prevention aspect of it was not there. I think we need to keep healthy people healthy as well. And a good night's sleep is good for everyone. So I think we need to also, it's also for people that already have a good night's sleep, that if they want to keep that for the next 20, 30 years, we need to talk about that too. So things can change in our life. So I think everyone can benefit from practical sleep tips. For increased awareness of sleep as a critical component of health and wellness. So the two main pillars for health seems to remain diet and exercise. We need to move more, to eat better, but I think sleep was always kind of a black sheep here. So I think to me, and I can say to you, many studies showing that having good night's sleep is as important as exercising every day and eating well in the package for good health. So I think we need to take that into account and not see sleep as a waste of time. So I think in our society, we still see that as a waste of time, and we cut on sleep for different reasons, for well-being, for pleasure, because we have too much work and so on and so forth. And we see as long as I move and I eat well, it doesn't matter if I sleep 4 or 5 hours a night, which is not true. So I think we need to see that as a whole over 24 hours. And how can we sustain those good or healthy behaviors over time for the rest of our lives? Increased focus on prevention rather than treatment of sleep disorders. I said that the sleep field comes more from the medical branch, but was really geared towards the treatment of sleep disorders, which is important. But I think we also need to talk more about the prevention aspect of it. And it can also help some policies or campaigns around like having a better night's sleep. So it's not just about telling our clients or patients to sleep better, so at the individual level, but also what companies can do to block, for example, the blue light from our screens, from our laptops and TVs, so people still use them, but it becomes less of a problem. Things like to eliminate daylight saving time. We're going to have that this weekend. So that's something that I think in the future will not exist. There's no benefits of that. I think just stupid. So we'll remove that. To have that in the wellness programs in many companies as well. So I think in most wellness programs, they talk about mental health, they talk about eating well, moving more, but sleep sometimes is there, but most of the time it's not there. So I think we need to talk about that. And by having the first sleep guidelines in Canada for adults in 2020, I think it's a first step towards a better programs. So next slide. And I just wrote this paper this year to talk about the fact that these are the first evidence-based sleep health guidelines for Canadian adults that we have in Canada. It's about time. We were using those in the US before, but we have our own Canadian guidelines as part of the 24 guidelines. And I think it began to apply to many people. And in that paper, it was mainly for healthcare providers and clinicians that they need to talk more about sleep with their patients. And also we know that by sleeping well, people are more likely to eat better and move more because you're less tired, you're more prone to exercise and move. And also we know that lack of sleep, we just eat more. So short sleepers eat about 350 calories more per day because the brain craves for high fat, high sugar food. So I think it's easier to maintain a healthy lifestyle if you start your day on the right foot with a good night's sleep. Next slide. And those questions, I think that was in 2019 or 2020, a paper I wrote with one of my colleagues talking about, to me, the 5 key dimensions or characteristic of sleep. So sleep duration, of course. So for adults, 7 to 9 hours per day. But also beyond that, the number is good, but also we need to have good sleep quality, because you can spend 4 or 5 hours in bed, or you can spend 10 hours in bed, but just getting 4 or 5 hours of good sleep. So we need to be efficient. So sleep quality was question 2 in those questionnaires. And that's those 6 questions take less than 2 minutes to answer. So it's a very quick snapshot of to know whether it's a good or bad sleep. The third one was about sleep timing. So when we talk about bedtime and wake up times, that can impact. And I also Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday, are you keeping the same bedtime and wake up time routine? So the best is yes. The fourth question was about daytime alertness. So of course you may have a good night's sleep, but if during the day you're yawning all the time, it's not good. So I think what happens during the daytime is important. And the last one was about to screen for possible sleep disorders, and the 2 key one here for question 5 and question 6. Next slide. And many tips that you probably heard. I think most people know them. We need to go to bed and wake up at the same time every day, even on the weekends. We tend to see a lot of catch-up sleep on the weekends for most people. Avoid caffeine consumption starting in the late afternoon. Avoid drinking alcohol in the evening because you fall asleep quicker, but the second part of your night, you just feel more warm and then you just wake up. So it impacts your sleep cycles. Avoid smoking cigarettes. It's a stimulant, so it's not good for your health, but not for your sleep as well. Expose yourself to bright light as much as possible, especially in the morning, because it enters your eye and it's good to maintain your 24-hour cycle. Make sure your bedroom is conducive to sleep. So it should be dark, quiet, comfortable, and cool. Sleep on a good mattress and pillow, so it's good to invest on that. We spend about 1/3 of our lives sleeping. Move every day, and I will add to that, especially outside. We know all the benefits of moving on sleep efficiency and sleep quality, but especially also outdoor physical activity, which tends to be even better than indoor physical activity for sleep. So I think spend at least 1 hour per day outside, even though you're moving your 30 minutes or 1 hour inside. Relaxing bedtime routine is important for kids, but for adults too. So a bath, music, reading before bed. So ideally no screens in the 30 minutes to 1 hour before bedtime. Don't go to bed feeling hungry. Don't eat a big steak before bed, but a light snack is always good. So you don't want to go to bed very hungry, but also not too full. Pets in the bedroom as well. It's one of those things that people say have a nice cat, a nice dog. It doesn't disturb my sleep, but it tends to do in general. And Travis will talk about that. Keep gadgets out of the bedroom, and especially don't use them in the at least 30 minutes before bed. Next slide. Q&A. So I think back to Jen for that.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation, JP. As a parent with a young child, I agree that daylight savings is tough and seems rather silly, but I think our attendees might benefit if you have any advice for them as adults, how to adjust to the time change this weekend. Do you have any tips for trying to maintain consistent sleep when sort of the world is telling us not to have consistent sleep?
Yeah. So I think the best is to maintain your routine, so the consistent bedtime and wake up time. And we tend to adjust pretty well. So 1 hour may seem a lot, but it's not. So I think within a couple of days, we tend to come back to normal. I will say to go outside as much as possible is very important. Some people will adjust with the couple of days leading to the night, Saturday to Sunday, to change their bedtime by about 15 minutes and then 30 minutes, 45 minutes. So then that night, that 1 hour is offset within those 3-4 days prior to Saturday to Sunday. But I will say in general, keep your routine with bedtime, wake up time, and then it will tend to adjust by itself. But I will prefer to see that not happening in Canada. I think in Europe and many places around the world, it doesn't happen. I think there's many bills in Ontario. There's one to eliminate that. So I don't know if it's coming. So there's some provinces not having it. Some they have it. So it's by province. So that's one problem. You need a critical mass before they all remove that. But in my opinion, it's going to come at some point.
Okay, great. Thank you. So there are some questions coming into the Q&A box. So I just want to remind all attendees that you're welcome to continue posting questions for JP or any of the speakers, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And just remember to please post with your name if you would like to be entered into the draw. So JP, I took a look at the questions that our attendees asked when they registered for the event, and you've already answered a lot of them by giving some sleep tips, but one student said that they're finding it hard to turn their brain off at night, given that their workspace is right next to their bed, and it's really hard to separate the two. And wanted to know if you had any tips for how to separate workspace and downtime to avoid enable them to fall asleep faster or have a more restful sleep.
Yeah. So that's a good question. I think we cannot change our house or the way our apartment is designed. In a perfect world, the bedroom should be only for sleeping, never for working, because we associate our bed or bedroom for sleeping. If work is part of our bedroom as well, so the brain doesn't know if I'm working or sleeping. So in a perfect world, go to the kitchen table for your work somewhere else in the house, but don't have your workstation in your bedroom as much as possible. Otherwise, I will say those same sleep tips, try to exercise as much as possible during the day. We know that when you go to bed, the body needs to be tired. And what happens in our life is that the brain, we have mental stress. The brain is tired, we overthink, and then the body isn't tired. So we need to keep this balance between mental activity and physical activity. So when you go to bed, you should be very happy to go to bed because you're of this fatigue. But people tend to go to bed and they're just so wired, so they don't wind down in the 1 to 2 hours before bedtime. So this routine helps as well, brushing your teeth, having a bath, reading a bit. So you know that bedtime is coming, you have this sleep pressure coming to you. So when you're ready to sleep, you should fall asleep within 15 minutes in a perfect world. But then there's many other reasons why people don't sleep well: stress, anxiety, work, whatever, or for me, noise with people around, stuff like that. But to answer your question short, ideally no workstation in your bedroom.
Okay. And so you've touched on the idea of taking a long time to fall asleep. And some of our attendees asked questions about, how do I maintain a consistent sleep schedule? I'm getting to bed, but I'm not actually falling asleep. So I don't know if you have any tips or suggestions about that. And if the follow-up to that was, is melatonin a good option on occasion?
Yeah. So I think the recommendation from sleep expert, if you don't fall asleep, don't stay in bed. So if after 45 minutes, 1 hour, you're still in bed, not falling asleep, go to a different room. Of course, don't use your gadget or your screens. Read a book. When you're tired again, go back to bed. So otherwise, you associate your bed with a place where it's very difficult to fall asleep, and you can suffer from sleep problems. If you have a real sleep problem, you need to consult a doctor for that, or you may need a different kind of treatment. But talking about melatonin, so melatonin, there's no real side effects, so you can find that over the counter, generally with pills 1 to 3 milligram, 2 hours before bed seems to work well for some people. But if it becomes that you need to rely on that every night to fall asleep, I think, to me, you don't address the root causes of the problem. So I think there's something else that you need to address. It's more something that you use to cope with your problem. So again, go outside as much as possible during the day, expose yourself to daylight. If you can sleep, go to a different room, read, and come back only when you're really tired. And at some point, if you're reading for something boring for 1 or 2 hours, you should be tired at some point.
Okay. And so let's say our attendees find themselves in a position where they're not able to fall asleep consistently, or they are feeling like they're becoming dependent on something like melatonin. Who do they consult with? Should they go talk to their doctor or a psychologist? Who's the best source?
Yeah, I think generally with your doctor, if you have one, of course. But yeah, there are some sleep experts. Sometimes private, you have to pay, but the first line will be your primary care provider, so your family doc. And then there's different options. But if they suspect a sleep disorder, so then you can have a test with polysomnography to see if there's something wrong with you, and then they can treat that. And otherwise, if it's just bad behaviors or something you can change in your life, and then that can help. And it can be something very mild like melatonin, which is there's no side effects. So I use that sometime when I travel, going to China or Australia, to reset my 24-hour cycle quicker, because you're jet lagged quite a bit. So and there's no problem with that.
Okay, excellent. So I think we have time for one more question, and for now, we'll get back to you in a little bit. Our guidelines talk about duration of sleep, so quantity of sleep, and then they also specify that that should be good quality sleep. And so some of the attendees were wondering, what does that mean? What defines good quality sleep? And how do I know if I'm having a good quality sleep?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that's something we discussed with the guidelines. So we can't really, as a guideline, to have good quality sleep, you can't really control that. What you can control is your sleep tips that I mentioned. So go outside, move, and stuff like that. So sleep quality, we tend to measure that with questionnaires. There's many. The Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index is the most widely used, which is 21 questions. But I think in research, we tend to use different devices, and what we tend to use for sleep quality is sleep efficiency. And sleep efficiency is a ratio of actual sleep duration, so when you're really sleeping, divided by time in bed. So of course, if it's 100% sleep efficient, is that you fall asleep within 1 second and then you wake up in the morning without having a pee or stuff like that. But as a rule of thumb, at least 85% sleep efficiency in your night from bedtime to wake up time will be good sleep quality. But if you wake up 3 times to go to pee and it takes you 1 hour to fall asleep, that will not be considered good sleep quality.
Okay. And so is having a good quality sleep then, I guess it's directly linked to your sleep hygiene. And so all the tips that you provided speak to sleep hygiene. I think that that's a term that maybe is confusing to some, but is that what sleep hygiene is practicing those tips?
Yeah, practicing those tips to go outside, to move, to have a snack before bed, no pets in the bedroom, remove gadgets, all of those tips. Yeah, and of course, considering you don't have any sleep problems.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chaput. Any unanswered questions we'll hopefully have some time to cover at the end of this session. I do see the Q&A is getting full. That's great. So keep the questions coming. But for now, I'd like to invite everyone to take a quick 1-minute stretch break. You can grab a glass of water or a snack and just get yourselves generally ready for the next half of the panel discussion. So we'll start again in about a minute. All right, we're back. I hope that everyone enjoyed a quick break. Feel free to keep any movement going as I introduce our next panelist. Dr. Travis Saunders is an associate professor in the Department of Applied Human Sciences at the University of Prince Edward Island. Dr. Saunders' research focuses on the health impact of sedentary behavior across the lifespan. He was the sedentary behavior content expert for Canada's 24-hour movement guidelines for adults. And so thanks for joining us, Dr. Saunders. You can now take it away.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tomasone. And I'd like to thank all the Exercises Medicine team for inviting me here today. This is a great opportunity and nice to see so many familiar faces. So I'm gonna see here if I can advance the slides. There we go. So I'll start off by talking about how the recommendations inform my research. So this is the first time that we've had specific threshold recommendations for sedentary time for the adult age group. So we are the first. This is the first time in Canada, but also internationally. And so one of the things I think is really important is just getting baseline information in terms of prevalence of how many people are meeting the guidelines with respect to total sitting time, and how many people are meeting the recommendations for recreational screen time. So for total sitting time, the recommendation is 8 hours or less a day, and for recreational screen time, it's 3 hours or less a day. And so, compared to physical activity or sleep, I think we're a little bit behind because we haven't had specific thresholds for those behaviors to aim for yet or to measure against. So I think that's one thing that needs to be done. I'm particularly interested as somebody who teaches a lot of undergrad and graduate students to see if any young people are really meeting these guidelines. I was really interested to see the stats that Dr. Tomasone just presented in the intro, because when I've surveyed my own students, the average seems to be more than 4 hours a day just for phone use on a given day, and so I'm very curious to see how many people are meeting those recreational screen guidelines and how many people can meet them. Another research question that I didn't list here that I think is very important is really looking at the threshold itself. So to determine whether those thresholds are the optimal thresholds, there was a question in the chat about, how do we come to decide these thresholds? And these are really based on expert consensus. So there have been a number of meta-analyses done to look at the optimal thresholds for where your risk of death starts to increase from total sitting time or recreational screen time. And when you look at those, the threshold where your risk really starts to increase all cluster somewhere between 7 to 9 hours a day for all-cause mortality. And so that's why we set the line at 8 hours a day for total sitting, and we saw a similar thing for about 3 hours a day where your risk increases for recreational screen time. But I think it's really important that we really start to look at the impact of a threshold of 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 hours a day to fine tune that specific threshold. I think that's very important. And I think, I know that there are quite a few studies now looking at that to see if that is the precise threshold or if it does need to be tweaked as we move forward. Some other research questions with respect to intervention studies are looking to see now how many participants meet guidelines before and after interventions. So I'm sure many of you have been involved in interventions to increase levels of physical activity. I think it's really important to also look to see, are these interventions impacting total sitting time, recreational screen time? Are they increasing breaks in physical activity? Because those are important endpoints as well. And the interventions that impact sedentary behavior may not be the interventions that impact physical activity or sleep. So I think it's really important to look specifically at those. And the other thing that I think is important is to really look at specifically replacing one movement behavior with another. So as JP mentioned, the impact of replacing screen time with physical activity may be different than replacing another behavior with physical activity. And so I think really specifically targeting some of those swaps in interventions will really help to identify not only what are the best things to do, but what are the most realistic for people to do. What are the most realistic changes that are going to bring about health benefits for those people? So looking at some ways to reduce sedentary time, it can be challenging because our lives are very sedentary, especially in COVID. Most of us are working from home, at least to some extent, spending a lot of time on screens at home. Like Dr. Tomasone mentioned, we're doing less active transportation. And so I think as with changing any behavior, the first step is to really look at your day and see when a behavior is required and when it's the default. And sitting is often the default in our lives, whether or not it's really the best way to do something. So for example, if the host could just move the next slide, I seem to be having a hard time. There we go, thank you. So we often do things sitting down, so working at your computer, talking on the phone, but if you could move ahead one more slide there. But you can work just as easily standing up for some things. So doing this webinar, JP is standing, I'm standing. Conference calls, you can often do standing. Computer work can be done while standing if you have the right setup. So if you could go to the next slide for me. You'll have to tap one more time, I think. And one more. There we go, thank you. So as you can see, a typical sitting desk can quite easily be converted into a standing desk. And the price of these desks has come down tremendously in the past 5 or 6 years. And there are also much better options. So the example here, this is a professor at Dalhousie University. He has an older model that you sit on top of your desk. Now there are much better models that the whole desk moves up and down, which are much more ergonomically sound. So there are lots of good options for people who, like me, spend all day working on a computer, so that you can choose to sit or stand based on your needs. And our research has shown that when you're working with a standing desk, not only do you sit less, which is great, but also you're more likely to go for a walk or move around a bit more, because walking or standing, you naturally move more than when you're sitting down. Could you move to the next slide for me, please? So another thing, and we did this quite often when I was working with JP at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, is consider whether all your meetings need to be done sitting down. It's pretty typical to sit around a table and chat. Walking meetings work well, especially with small groups. So I'd encourage you to think about whether or not, especially at the end of this pandemic, whether or not you could go for more walks outside as opposed to meetings sitting around a table. I mean, if you're having a phone conversation with your supervisor or colleagues now, there's no reason you can't do that on your cell phone and go for a nice walk, as opposed to just sitting down at your desk. Next slide, please. Another thing that's really important is to take breaks. And so there are a number of ways to help you do this. So host, if you could tap ahead, there we go. So if you're watching TV, take a break during commercial breaks. If you're watching traditional TV as opposed to Netflix, this works really well when you're watching live sports. You know, every time there's a commercial break, pop up, move around, go get a drink. Drinking lots of water is going to help you as well. Take lots of breaks because it's going to force you to go to the washroom at least every hour or two. Next bullet, please. And there are lots of software options here that can help as well. So if you're working a lot on your computer and you want to be reminded to take a break, there are lots of free options that will pop up on your screen and lock you out or remind you to take a break. There are lots of apps that you can use on your smartphone as well. Next slide. So I think another really, really important thing that you can do is to change your environment. So I find when I'm working on a paper, it's really hard to remember to stop sitting every 20 minutes because it kind of ruins the whole flow. I find it much easier to change my environment by having a standing desk. In my house, you know, we work really hard to keep screens away from our bedroom and keep them out of our children's bedrooms. To make that a healthy environment, we keep screens away from the kitchen table. You know, there's no phones there, there's no TV on while we're eating. And there's lots of research, especially in kids, to show that leaving a TV on in the background is really not a good thing. A lot of people do it, but it really minimizes conversation with people. It lends this idea that screens are sort of always on and always a part of our lives. And so I think looking at our environment to see how can we minimize screens and only use them when we really choose to use them is a really helpful thing to do. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, there are a bunch of apps to help you with your smartphone use specifically. And I think if you're concerned about your smartphone use, the first thing to do is to measure it. Because once you see how much time you spend on your phone, it can really help you to decide if you need to make changes and how to make changes. So if you're using your phone 4 or 5 hours a day, that's a lot of time to spend doing anything in your life, let alone something that we know is not particularly good for you. So I would really recommend that you keep an eye on your use and then use that to start making changes as you move forward. Next slide. So the one thing I will say, and I often get questions about this for occupational sitting, is don't take things too far. I know some people that swear by treadmill desks. I know other people that say that they're just very expensive coat racks. I've never used a treadmill desk myself personally, but I think sometimes people get really, really stressed about this and think, well, I should never sit down. I need to have the most active option and never sit. And that's not what we're aiming for. Sitting is natural. We need to sit. It's about having the option to limit our time sitting and to have the option to not use screens when we need to have those breaks from screen use. I think if we're consciously sitting and consciously using our screens, that's much better than just always being the default, which unfortunately I think is the case for a lot of people. So that is my my prepared remarks for today, and now I'm ready for any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Travis, for the practical tips, which are so relevant for students and all of us who are spending all our time at our desks. And something that you said kind of made me chuckle about how it doesn't have to be expensive. And I thought I would just let our viewers know that I am actually standing at my ironing board with a box of my kids' pull-up diapers on it with my laptop on top of that. And that is my standing desk for this webinar. So yeah, students can definitely get creative. So many of the questions that were submitted in advance were around tips for reducing sedentary time. And so you captured some of those already. But an attendee did have a good question about the duration of sedentary breaks. And so how long should sedentary breaks be for them to be effective?
Sure, and that's a great question. And that's something that we didn't specifically put in the guidelines because there hasn't been, no one's looked really at that specifically, but there have been a number of lab-based studies that have shown that in terms of the metabolic impacts of sitting, those tend to be drastically reduced if you're getting up every 20 to 30 minutes for somewhere between 1 and 3 minutes of movement. So most studies are around 2 minutes of movement at a light to moderate intensity. So if like we're doing during this webinar, every 20 minutes or 30 minutes, you're getting up, you're doing some form of movement at whatever intensity you can manage, that's probably going to be pretty beneficial. And so that's something that I often try, do a few squats, do a few burpees, whatever you can manage in your workspace without really bothering your roommates and lab mates, is something that's probably going to be beneficial to you.
Okay, that's great. And maybe something I'll just mention right now is just acknowledging that like not every single body is able to stand, and that it is possible to take sedentary breaks in a traditionally seated position. Do you have any suggestions for what that might look like?
Yeah, well, I guess anything that involves any form of movement. So as much movement as you can do is really going to be beneficial, because it seems like a lot of the metabolic impacts of sitting are from not engaging the muscles that we're able to engage. So if you can move your arms, that's probably going to be beneficial. If you can do some sort of leg exercise where you're at, that's probably going to be beneficial. So I think based on your personal situation as well as the work situation, any form of movement is going to be better than a lack of movement. And thank you for pointing that out, because that does often get overlooked.
Yeah, we just were very careful in our messaging of the guidelines to not send a message that implied that people who sit and need to sit for their well-being can't, they still have the option to reduce sedentary time. So
absolutely.
Thanks for pointing that out.
And just to clarify, sedentary behavior, it's not just sitting, it's when you're sitting and burning very few calories. So by sitting down and doing any form of movement, you're not being sedentary anymore. So it's sometimes people think it's the sitting, and it's not the sitting, it's the lack of movement that really is the issue.
So it's more of an energy expenditure.
Exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
Excellent. And so some of our attendees, please keep the questions coming, because even if we can't get to them right now, Travis can answer them when Dr. Sabiston is speaking. So please keep using that Q&A box. But Travis, one of the things that some of the students commented on is that they're worried about their work flow and whether there would be any work performance or academic downsides to using a standing desk or to breaking up sedentary time. I wondered if you could speak to that.
That's a great question. And one of the things that we looked at in our overview was whether or not activity permissive workstations, so standing desks or desks that allow you to pedal or move somehow while you're working, whether that impacts your work performance. And there's really no evidence that it has any impact on your work performance positively or negatively. And so I think I understand the concern of taking a break every 20 minutes. I would find that quite disruptive. If I'm really doing something that I need to think and really get engaged in, taking a break might be challenging at times. And that's why I think if you have a workstation that allows you to be more active while you're using it, whatever that looks like, that is something that I find can work well when you do have to spend 2 or 3 hours engaged in something, because then you can do that movement while you're working. So right now I could be typing using this desk and I'm moving a bit. It's not really distracting me at all, but I'm still minimizing my sedentary time. And there are lots of ways to do that. So I think that's why if you're breaking up your sitting time or your sedentary time, while you can, but also then trying to use the most active workstation that you can, I think that's going to give you the best of both worlds.
Right. Okay. Great tips. Double whammy. Take it on all fronts. So we actually have some students who are really interested in mechanisms. And so some questions came in around the mechanisms connecting sedentary time and the poor health outcomes. And so I don't know if you're able to speak to that. Why does sedentary time lead to these poor health outcomes?
Sure, and there's a couple things. So this lack of energy expenditure or muscle engagement seems to have some effects on the muscles themselves, where they start to, they stop taking up sugar and fat out of our bloodstream. So if your muscles aren't engaged, they no longer have that need for fuel. And so they just stop taking up those fuel sources, which means that the amount of sugar and fat in your blood rise. And so over the long term, that's going to increase your risk of heart disease and diabetes. So that's one physiological mechanism that's happening. And that's why just engaging your muscles in any way that you can is a way to maintain that uptake into those muscles, which is healthy. The other thing is that screen-based sedentary behavior in particular displaces other healthy behaviors. So as JP mentioned, it's displacing sleep. It also often leads to increased food intake. It can lead to mindless eating or actually often expose you to food ads. If you spend any time on Pinterest or Facebook, there's an awful lot of food ads on there. TV commercials work. They make you want to eat more food. They can also be socially isolating. And so I think sitting, there are some physiological impacts, but also screens displace all these other things that we know are really good for us. And so it's kind of that, again, that double whammy of hitting us from both sides.
Great. Okay, excellent. And you mentioned the screen time in there, and I know that sometimes students have questions around what's counting towards recreational screen time, because the guidelines specify recreational screen time without necessarily saying sedentary recreational screen time. So a student asked, if I do an online fitness or yoga class, does that count towards my 3 hours of recreational screen time because I'm doing that in my recreational time?
That's an excellent question. And I think I personally would not consider that to be a part of it, because the guidelines say, 8 hours of sedentary time, and then included in that is the 3 hours of recreational screen time. So I personally would not. And I know JP might want to chime in afterwards, because I know he's done some research specifically looking at this to see if screen-based activity programming is positive or negative for people. But I think that's a good use of screens. And that's a good example of where I think if we're using screens consciously, of when they're useful, when they're beneficial to us, as opposed to using them mindlessly to kill time. There's a big difference in the impact they have on us in those two situations.
Right. Okay. So the new norm of getting our activity at home, and often through these online apps and YouTube videos and things like that perhaps that doesn't necessarily count towards that 3 hour limit. It is more a 3 hour sedentary recreational screen.
Exactly. And I will say, I think personally, in PEI, we've been lucky this year to sometimes we're allowed to go to the gym and sometimes we're not. But I do find the new normal of working out online is certainly better than nothing. But when you're able to do activity with other people, I think it's, for a lot of us, better still. And so I think it's still not bad for us, I think, to do your online workouts. But I think if you can get outside and do it with other people, you're going to get more benefits than you would doing it in your basement like I am right now.
Right. Perfect. Well, thank you, Travis. I think that might be a perfect segue to Kathy's talk around physical activity. So we'll come back to you at the end. So keep questions coming, everyone, and Dr. Saunders can try to answer them during Kathy's session here. But I'd like to introduce Dr. Sabiston. So Catherine Sabiston is a professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education at U of T, and she's the director of the Mental Health and Physical Activity Research Center. She holds a Canada Research Chair in Physical Activity and Mental Health, and her research broadly focuses on psychosocial determinants and outcomes of physical activity to inform evidence-based practice. Her work has advanced theory and methods in sport and exercise psychology, and we're very lucky to have her with us today. So I'll pass it over to you now, Dr. Sabiston.
Thanks, Jen. And as I try to move my slides forward, I'll just say that I feel like a bit of an imposter on this panel because I was not involved in the development of the guidelines, but I'm here as someone who uses them regularly in my research. And so far, these have been great talks. And I am standing as well. So Travis, I am also standing. Okay, so I could stand here and talk to you about, sort of the physical activity guidelines, and I'm happy to answer any questions more generally about them. But what I thought I'd do is present around the guidelines and what it means for mental health specifically. And so I wanted to start out by demonstrating that there's really uncontested evidence that physical activity not only leads to, sort of improvements in mental health, it's also tied to prevention of some mental illness, improvements in quality of life for individuals who are diagnosed with mental illness, as well as we know that some forms of physical activity are used even in the treatment of mental illness. And when I was asked to be part of this panel, one of the questions that we were asked to answer was, how do physical activity recommendations inform your research and your practice? And to answer this question, I sort of thought about it. A lot of the trials that we run, a lot of the health service delivery programs that we have, we often feel that the guidelines are a bit of we use them with a bit reservation, restriction, trepidation. And I'm going to explain why, from a mental health perspective, the guidelines before the new guidelines were a little bit challenging. So when we're working with individuals who have symptoms of depression, anxiety, we also work with a lot of individuals with poor body image. And on your screen here are a number of the symptoms that we hear from individuals. So anything from sort of a lack of interest, really strong feelings of shame and guilt, worthlessness, a lot of fears and uncertainties, feeling overwhelmed. There's a number of symptoms tied to mental health that counter or that make physical activity challenging. And so one of the big things to keep in mind is no matter where you're implementing physical activity guidelines or recommendations, it's to highlight that physical activity has to be perceived as obtainable, enjoyable, and preferred. And so this is in particular important for populations that we study that have any of the symptoms that are on your screen right now. So when we think of this in context, for the most part, when we work with individuals across the lifespan in clinical populations as well as healthy, we generally have a number of barriers. And if I was to encapsulate those barriers here on the screen, it's really that people say they're too tired, there's too little time, they're too healthy to exercise, it's too costly, it costs too much money, or they have too little motivation. So these are what we hear when we traditionally talk about implementing physical activity recommendations into one's day or life. And what I want to point out is that when we work with clinical populations that we do, we oftentimes try to address these barriers with things like trying to work with the individuals on the timing of physical activity. That can help if you're too tired. There's different times of the day when you can work out or include exercise or movement at times of the day when you're less likely to be tired. And I know there were some questions that were posted around, is there a particular time of day that's more valuable than others? And other than what we just heard around sleep, there are no good or bad times of day to be more active. So the key part is to get physical activity into your day at times when you're least tired. Also, small bursts of physical activity are important when you have very little time. If individuals say they're too healthy, they don't need to exercise. We can also highlight that physical activity has a number of benefits. You know, early slides showed things like mood and feelings of accomplishment, as well as all the physical and mental health and social health benefits. We also know that physical activity can be low cost, and this is where trying to dispel the myth that physical activity is, biking, running, swimming, weight training. And I think the guidelines have done a good job of highlighting that activity is activity beyond those what we traditionally hear of as physical activity. And many of those are low cost or no cost. And also individuals with little motivation, it's really important to highlight these movements that are within their control or their autonomy. Then when we add to all of those barriers, we add all of the symptoms that I had on my previous screen. These are also then physical activity barriers. So having no interest, low energy, and then the negative emotions and fears. And so what I want to point out too is that when we're working with individuals, it's important to highlight that find physical activity that's enjoyable, and oftentimes that's light intensity activity. Different timing of activity, different types of physical activity are really important. And the context for in terms of addressing fears is particularly important. So moving movement into the context that are comfortable and not fearful for individuals. And then just to highlight that before the new guidelines came out, there was no focus on light intensity. So when we do work, we often focus on low intensity physical activity. And the reason for this slide is just to highlight that we see a number of significant improvements with low intensity physical activity. This is with students on campus at the University of Toronto who were help-seeking students referred from health and wellness. And we also see it with breast cancer survivors, where it was the light intensity and moderate intensity physical activity that was important for reduction in depression symptoms over time. So as much as I said that the guidelines, I used the guidelines with trepidation, those were the previous guidelines. The new 24-hour movement guidelines or recommendations really do help with the work that we do. Number one, in terms of the dose, the guidelines now suggest that it's important to remember that some activity is better than none, which is really helpful for us in the work that we do, and all the barriers that I just highlighted. That bouts of activity, the guidelines used to say at least 10-minute bouts, and now we have that restriction is removed. And so these small bouts that you've heard about throughout this webinar are valuable. They're all part of this movement guideline, which is, again, extremely helpful for a number of clinical populations that we work with. The intensity, so now we have a focus on light intensity and standing. So again, those are important additions to the 24-hour movement guidelines. And the context. So in the guidelines now, they suggest that a variety of environments and contexts are important for physical activity. And in particular, for mental health, we know that leisure activity as well as the active transport are extremely important. And so the context comes through in the new guidelines. So just to finish off, the contextual factors should inform the focus and scope of physical activity guidelines. So making sure that you're thinking about the dose and the bouts and where being active, and we can talk about more about that in the Q&A period. Also important to highlight, just in general, all of the facets of physical activity and not just the total minutes of activity in one day or week. And then other considerations for mental health, I just wanted to highlight that in particular, it's also important to remember that while sedentary behavior, as we heard, has detrimental effects on health, we also have to remember that the different populations that we work with, that sometimes the sedentary behavior has benefits and that it's the intent that matters. So, being able to take a break or, sort of take that time to be sedentary for some individuals in some clinical capacities is important. And also, as we also heard, sleep quantity is important, but also sleep quality, in particular around mental health. So those are the last points that I'll make, and I will take it to answer any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathy. Your discussion about the barriers to physical activity is really timely and relevant, as we know that COVID has really compounded the number of barriers that people are facing. And so I thought we might start our Q&A with a question that was submitted in advance. Some students are wondering, what are some tips during COVID to promote exercise as medicine? Well, gyms are closed and then they're open and then they're closed. It's cold outside. People are starting to feel frustrated. Do you have any motivational tips for our attendees?
Yeah, there's a number of things that we can do to incorporate more movement in our day. Some of the key things I think would be we're in a home environment. And so if you can cognitively attach with intention things in your home to movement, it is a helpful reminder or a prompt to be more active. And so an example of that is every time I use the toaster, the microwave, or the kettle, while that 1 minute or 2 minutes is happening, I can do, push-ups on the counter or squats. And so in my mind, I've attributed my small appliances in my kitchen to doing some form of activity. And so I think it's important to think about your environment. And again, prompts are really important to help us. We heard also setting timers or, the things that come up on your computer. Also, for those who browse social media, if you're on social media, when you open that social media app, start walking, and walk around your house. And so again, you have to make those links, but that's one of the things you can do. Obviously with COVID, there's been one of the best innovations we've seen is around social innovations and around exercise innovations or online. And so checking out a number of online videos. I know at the University of Toronto, the Move You crew have a number of free exercise videos that people can jump in on and use. So again, really important. Being outside, in particular for mental health as well, the outdoors is critical. So if you can get outside, use the environment, the stairs, the hills that are around you. If you go for a walk, pick up the pace, every lamppost or every house or every blue car, to try to sort of just add a little bit of intensity to those walks that you do. And the other thing is, it sounds funny to say this, but I've said it many times through the pandemic, is to use the accelerometer or the pedometer in your devices, because as much as we leave our phones wherever we're most likely to be, if you carry it with you and it's a pedometer, it gives you a little bit of feedback on how much you're moving. And those steps counts can help, or that movement that you're doing in your house or your home can help give you a gauge on where you are. So as much as we would think, well, we're not going anywhere, we don't have to measure our steps, it's actually pretty important right now to measure what we're doing and how much we're moving. So use, your technology to your advantage. The last thing I'll say is, I have, with my colleagues, we have these little friendly competitions, and we use Map Your Run or Map Your Walk apps. And we've come up with this idea where we try to do animals. So every time that I go out, I try to make an animal and I text it to my colleague and he texts me back one. And so we've had polar bears and elephants and llamas and flying pigs. So it's become a really fun way of, sort of adding some fun pieces, both socially and with movement. So some tips.
Yeah, that sounds like a really great idea to build that social component in, as Travis was saying, like being active with others. And so even if we can't be with others, we know that we're doing it with others in this virtual space. And that would require quite a bit of, I'm directionally challenged. I don't know that I would be able to follow the pattern. So my animal might not look as good as yours.
There's been many snakes as well, because that's a pretty simple one.
Right. Okay, I'll start with a couple of snakes.
Yeah.
That's funny. That's great. Maybe I'll just ask one more question that's related to more around some of the work that you've done around body image and sort of like perceptions of one's body. So the question came in advance, and it was, how can negative body image and insecurities influence physical activity participation? And then the follow-up is, what resources would you suggest for individuals who are apprehensive to engage in physical activity for reasons including but not limited to things like anxiety, insecurity, body image, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question around body image. What we've seen is, through the pandemic in particular, we've seen a heightened sense of self-criticism, because not only are we now spending all of our time looking at ourselves while we talk and while we present and while we do the work that we do, and unfortunately, a lot of society places a lot of emphasis on body and appearance. And so tied to that are all of the changes in terms of physical activity and health behaviors that we've seen and heard. And I say to people that it feels like you're living in a mirror. There's constant feedback to yourself, and we're not used to that. And so one of the drawbacks of the pandemic has really been this sort of self-criticism, inwards, sort of feedback that you're not used to having. And it's important that we highlight that it's about the body's function and performance rather than appearance. And if we can, sort of start to think about strategies to highlight what your body can do rather than what it looks like, those are the things that are in our control. And physical activity, as well as, sleep and sedentary behavior, as we've already spoken about, all three of these are particularly good for what the body can do. So highlight and challenge yourself on small steps to move more. If it's helpful, creating an environment where you have positive affirmations, you can use sticky notes and you can place in places and have positive thoughts. If it's challenging to be on camera, obviously a lot of people choose to not be on camera. So there's a number of things that are tied to body image that are particularly important these days. Because of the more, focus on feedback that we're getting on ourselves. And it's, again, just important to highlight that it's about performance of the body and how the body performs and functions over what the body can do.
That's a really good thing for us to remember. Not, I think, even just now during the pandemic, but even once we come out of this, it's just a good take-home lesson to keep in mind. So thanks for sharing that. That was some really great insight for all of our attendees. So maybe with the remaining time that we have, I'll invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras on so that we can answer some more questions from our attendees, which are a bit broader in scope. And attendees, please continue to use the Q&A function if you have thought of any questions as our speakers were chatting. And so maybe I'll just pick up, it was already mentioned, Kathy mentioned it, around the timing of movement behaviors, and that there probably isn't necessarily a best time to do physical activity necessarily. We know that consistent sleep time is important, and I just thought I'd give Travis and JP a chance to comment on anything else around timing of the movement behaviors.
Travis, you want to go first?
Well, I guess I would simply just reiterate what JP said, that I think with respect to sedentary behavior, I think the important thing is to avoid it near sleep as much as possible. So definitely in your bedroom, that's very clear, but the earlier you can disengage from screens, I think relative to sleep is probably a good thing. And that would be the main thing I would highlight with sedentary behavior.
With timing of sleep for adults, I think later bedtimes tend to be associated with more adverse lifestyle behaviors, because we tend to snack more while watching TV. So I think the behaviors later during the day seems to be worse. So for people with a late chronotype, people that like to go to bed late, just to be cognizant of that and try to have healthy snacks or stuff like that, as opposed to junk food around you. And try to have a bedtime that matches your sleep duration recommendation. So you want minimum 7. So of course, if you go to bed at midnight and you know you have to wake up at 5 or 6 a.m., it's not going to happen. So of course, trying to think about that.
Great, excellent, thank you. So one of our students asked whether there's an optimal point in your life to start striving towards meeting the guidelines to experience health benefits. So if a student has not been regularly active in the past and begins now, is that good enough? What if their parents or grandparents have been inactive their whole life and they start now? Is it possible to make up for lost time?
I think there's no time to start good behaviors. Same with smoking, same with any lifestyle behaviors. If you're 75, 80, you start now, good for you. I think it took you some time, but I think it's never too late to me to start good behaviors.
For sure. I think the recommendation in the guideline, like some is better than none. Like you get the most benefit from starting somewhere. So start now, even if you feel like you haven't done it in the past. Yeah. Kathy, did you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say too that across the lifespan, there's obviously different benefits of physical activity. And so, as a student, you may be engaging in physical activity for certain reasons, but as you age, there's other reasons. And so, just being able to get out of a chair on your own is something that's very valuable for an older adult. And being able to focus on any time that you can sort of engage in activity to be able to get to that point of activities of daily living, essentially, is important. So there's different benefits, but all the benefits that we've talked about roll out across the lifespan. And I would just echo that there is no good time to start, and now is a good time to start.
And I think we need to be realistic about the guidelines. Some people, it's a stressor to see those guidelines. You see the 150, minimum 7 hours of sleep, no more than 8 hours of sitting time. They are so far away from that even moving 1 minute more per day will be good for you. Reducing 1 minute of TV per day will be good for you. So any little step counts, matters. So I think it needs to be emphasized. There are not minimum thresholds. I think moving towards is way more important to me than at least that threshold. So I think that's a message that people should not be stressed out about that.
And the thing I would add, I guess it's important to start, like, I agree, today is a good day to start. But also, as someone who teaches a lot of kinesiology students, I think we also need to spend time thinking about how are we going to maintain these things with various life challenges as you move into a job, as you potentially have children or get into other life stressors. It's important to start these behaviors, but it takes work to maintain these behaviors too. And so I think it's important to kind of think about whenever you're going through a major life change, how are you going to maintain a healthy lifestyle with that change? Because oftentimes people stop temporarily and then it can be challenging to get going. So being conscious of that, I think, is really important.
And thinking about the acute effects versus the chronic effects. So if 1 day per week you sleep 4 hours per night, it's not going to kill you. So everything will come back to normal the day after you sleep well. Same with sitting time or physical activity. So I think we need to look at that as a whole. And if that day was not perfect, that's fine. I think I rarely have one perfect day myself. So I think it's a matter of a balance and trying to have the healthier 24 hour you can get. And some days it's not going to happen. That's fine too.
So maybe being kind and gentle to ourselves and allowing, recognizing, actually, if the audience were to look at our clock on our images, we did work hard to try to show that these behaviors are interrelated, but it's okay if they take up different amounts of time each day, that not every single day has to look exactly the same, and it's not ever going to look exactly the same, and that's okay, that there's this flexibility inherent in the guideline recommendations as well. So I'm cognizant of the time, but I thought that this was a really neat question and it might be a nice way to end off. So the question was, there are a lot of recommendations in the guidelines. If I wanted to make a change in my own behavior or make suggestions to a close family member or friend, what would my first step be? Is there one aspect of the guidelines that might be most beneficial immediately, or a behavior that is the most time sensitive? So maybe I'll start with Kathy, and then you can pass it over to someone after you're done, Kathy.
Well, I mean, I think the evidence that you presented early on in this webinar too demonstrates that physical activity or movement is probably where you would start. However, I would start with also the caveat that if adding physical activity seems like the most daunting thing in the world, then don't start with physical activity, because it's about the behavior that you feel you have the most control over and the most autonomy to make a change and that you're confident in. Because if you start somewhere and you're not confident in it, it sets up a cycle of failure, which then just means it's all out the door. So start with the behavior that you feel most confident you can change, and start small and move on to that.
Very good advice.
I fully agree. I think start with the low-hanging fruits. The biggest bang for the buck in terms of 1 minute change for me will be higher between physical activity, sleep, and center behavior will be physical activity for impacting mental health, physical health. But for many people, it's the most difficult one as well. So I guess it depends on what you can change and keep that change for the next 30 years if you can. So it needs to become a routine in your life. You need to enjoy it. It's important. So if you don't like to go to the gym, don't go to the gym. And Kathy said that you don't need to sweat. There's many ways it can be free. But among the three behaviors, we can't compare them. They're all three very important. They are connected. But the biggest bang for the buck will be MVP to me. But sometimes Ren Rhodes did some work on that. Which one is the easiest for you to change? And sleep came up many times as the easiest one. People would like to sleep more, but sometimes there's some barriers to that as well. But in your life, in your situation, which one do you think you can change? I think asking people.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think the most important thing is, what is the healthiest lifestyle you can enjoy, and making that decision, because that's going to be the sustainable choice. So I agree 100% with everything the two of you just said.
Excellent. Well, that's some very sound advice to end off our webinar today. Thank you to all of you for sharing your expertise and being so open to answering our attendees' questions. I'll pass it back now to our EIMC host, who will wrap us up.
Okay, thank you everyone, to our panelists and attendees. We would like to show our appreciation to our panelists with providing you a gift card that can be used to provide a donation to an organization of your choice at canadahelps.ca. We hope we were able to answer the majority of your questions today. A recording of today's panel discussion will be available on our YouTube channel and social media pages. And if you asked a question in advance or during the event today, you will be placed in a draw to win one of 5 $15 e-gift cards, like I mentioned. And if you only use your first name, maybe send us an email so we can figure out your email to send you in case you win. And we would also greatly appreciate if the attendees could take the time to fill out our feedback survey to benefit future events. So thank you all and have a great rest of your day.